Hey guys, it's Barrett with the Gimpy Camper. So we have had our generator, our Predator 3500 in our camper for about 2 years now. We've also had our solar panels, our lithium batteries, and our 750 watt small modified sine wave inverter in the camper for about a year now. And all that's working okay, but it could be just a little bit better. So there's times whenever my wife wants to use a blow dryer, or we want to use a microwave, or we want to watch TV, and we have to go out and start the generator. And it's kind of a big pain if we're dry camping, especially if we're just spending the night somewhere, because the way everything's set up now, you have to do that manually. So you have to go out to the generator, you have to pull the slide out, and then you have to go to the bay, you got to get the main cord, and you got to run it from the power inlet all the way to the generator, just like you're plugging in at a campground. And it can be a little bit of a pain, as well as that modified sine wave inverter that's mainly for my cpap. It's mounted in the storage bay here, and I have to manually get in there and flip that thing on and off. And so I started thinking about how I could make this better. We have a lot of trips coming up for the next year that involve dry camping, so I was trying to kind of get prepared for the next season and just trying to go the extra mile, make things easier and more useful for us. I want to start by saying I'm not a professional, so I did these things, it's the way I did them. I don't say that they're 100% right or anything like that, so if you can do any of this stuff, it's at your own risk, okay? Now, whenever you're starting to think about using an inverter to power your whole camper, the number one thing that you want to remember is that you don't want to use the inverter to power the whole camper. Specifically, there's one thing that you don't want to power, and that's the converter. Your inverter takes DC power from the batteries and turns it into 120 volt AC power to send out to the camper. Well, the converter takes 120 volt AC power and then charges the batteries with 12 volt power. So it turns the 120 into 12 volt. And so, as you can see, that's like a circular pattern. And if you power the converter with the batteries in the inverter, then it's just going to quickly drain your batteries, because it's just going to go in this, they call it a never-ending loop, or an infinite loop. Now, my camper is a 50 amp camper. Granted, I hardly ever use 50 amp service. I most exclusively use 30 amp service. But I do want to retain the 50 amp ability there. And so I used a 50 amp transfer switch as what I had planned for that. Now, in the front part of the camper, where I put my inverter and where the generator is, technically all of that stuff's 30 amp service, and I only needed 30 amps worth of stuff up there. Now, my camper's a 50 amp camper. Even though I most exclusively use 30 amp service, I've only used the 50 amp cord like twice. It's big, it's heavy, I don't like messing with it, so I don't. Now, I do want to retain that, so I did plan on using a 50 amp transfer switch for that main power. But it got a little confusing because the inverter and the generator, they're both more of a 30 amp circuit. And so I got confused on how I should do this. So I talked to Steve over at Shelburne RV. He told me to use a 50 amp transfer switch because that made the most sense. It was the easiest to deal with. And so that's what I did, and it did make sense. And after I started thinking about this, I thought, well, I could make this a little bit easier, because that's what the lazy man does. He makes things as easy as possible. I got the remote starter for my generator. So as long as it's out, which in decent weather, I'll just leave it out for the weekend while we're here in the camper. But I wanted the ability to turn on the inverter, and then if the batteries got low when the solar wasn't keeping it topped off, just be able to turn on the generator, boom, charge the batteries up, turn it off, done, all automatic. So then I changed my plan to use 2 transfer switches. So I had a 50 amp transfer switch in the back, and I decided to put a 50 amp transfer switch in the front. And I decided to do the 50 amp for one reason. And that reason was I looked at my power distribution center, and it's got 2 legs because it's a 50 amp camper. Well, one leg was everything that I didn't care if the inverter ran. This consisted of the converter, the fireplace, the hot water heater, and the air conditioner. So all that stuff I didn't care about. So I just won't power that circuit. So in my brain, I'm thinking, we'll have 2 transfer switches. The one in the back is the main transfer switch, so it decides if power's coming in from shore power and letting that power on through to the power center. If power comes in through this other cable from any other source, then it switches over and uses that. And so if you don't have shore power, all you have to do is just flip something on there and it'll have a 30-second delay, and then it'll pop over, and that 30-second delay is built in apparently so that your generator won't have a huge load on it when it starts up, which makes sense because that kind of lets it idle out and then it adds the load. So that's a good thing to have. So my plan, after seeing how my power distribution center was wired up, was just to not power that one leg with the inverter. That let me retain powering the converter and everything when it was on generator power, because I'd have the generator into the transfer switch, powering both legs, which would power both legs eventually at the power distribution center, which would turn on the converter and charge the batteries. However, my plan with the inverter, whenever it was in that default position, was to just let power go through one leg, let it go all the way through, and only power the one leg in the camper, which would automatically fix the issue that I had. Now there are other ways to turn the converter off. You can use things called contactors, you can rewire it, you can do a lot of different stuff like that. But to me, this seemed like the easiest way. It's not the cheapest way, but it seemed like the easiest way. Now there were some problems with that, and we'll get into that in a little while. So when we started the project, I started inside where the remote for the inverter would go, and I was going to move my battery monitor in there. Previously, the battery monitor has been out here because I didn't want to fool with wiring it up through the wall. But I thought with this big of a project, I needed to change that, and I needed to know what my battery level was while I was inside. So I did take it off of here. I got a longer cable and we ran it through. So let's go see what happened there. So here we are inside the camper. We have our main in command display here. And so I thought this would be a good place for the battery monitor and the inverter remote. Now also for the battery monitor, because some people put it in the wall down here under the cabinet that have this same trailer, but my daughter does still sleep on the bed here. And so this light turns on and it can be bothersome. So I wanted it to not shine directly in her face. And it turned out nice because it's right next to the main center and all my other switches and everything. So I really like the way that it ended up being right here. So what we did is we used a hole saw to cut this out. Now, if I had to do it over again, I'd put a little bit of painter's tape or something on there because it did leave a couple of blemishes on the cabinet. But down here where the inverter control is, I just held it up there. I used a mark around it, and I used the oscillating saw to cut that out. And that turned out real well. And I don't know how America was built without an oscillating saw, because those things are awesome. Now to fish this wire through, I noticed that there was a stud right about here, and there's a vent pipe right about here, and then there's another stud over here. And so I had to be really careful on that. So I did use a stud finder, and I found exactly where the stud is here. And I knew from looking at the basement that I had about 4 inches between there and the vent pipe, which lined up pretty good with being right inside the corner of this cabinet. So that means if the end of that stud's right there, that vent pipe's about right there. So I did make a hole there. I'll show you some pictures of that. And I did make it pretty big so that I had a little bit of room to move the fish around. I tried to fish a wire down through here one time when I was first trying to do the battery monitor, and my fish actually got stuck. I had to cut it off and leave it in the wall, so I was pretty paranoid about that. But this worked out fine right here. So I put the fish down, and then in the basement I could find the fish, and I tied a string to it. And I pulled the string back up, and then to the string I attached the wire for the remote and the wire for the battery monitor, and I pulled them down through the wall. Worked out pretty good. Did leave a little bit of a bigger hole since I started with the bigger hole. I went over that with some insulating foam and some low expansion foam, that's important. And that sealed it up pretty good. It's not the best it looks, but it's behind the cabinet and I'm fine with it. Now the next thing that we did is we installed our 50 amp transfer switch in the back. Our power inlet is in the wall on this side. The wire came in from there, went behind the furnace, which is underneath the fridge, over to the power distribution center, which is right there. Now, I was hoping that I could just splice in the transfer switch right there, but that wasn't a possibility. I didn't have enough extra wire. So I did have to rewire all of that whole piece from the power inlet all the way over. So what I did is I rewired the power inlet, and I used that. I left a little bit of extra slack to get to the transfer switch, which I did mount right here where this vent is for the furnace. Now, that may cause me a problem because it stays up about a ½ an inch over the height where I could remove the furnace. So if I ever have to remove the furnace, which I probably will because I've not had too good of luck with it, then I'll have to move that transfer switch. Now, from the transfer switch over to the power distribution center, which is right there, I did leave about 2 feet of extra wire, so I should be able to just move it out of the way instead of having to unwire it and all that stuff. But that's just the price of playing the game, homies. So from the transfer switch that's right here, open this cabinet where I have an outlet that's just for my portable AC and heat pump that sits in the corner over here, because it's got its own power inlet. That's how I get away with using 30 amp service. But down here behind this panel is where that power inlet come in. And so in here, there's also where the propane comes in. I did drill a hole. So then I used a 3/4 inch plastic conduit right angle in order to take some 10-3 SJO out from this compartment down under the camper. I sealed all that up with spray foam as well as some sealant that was Chemlink. Seemed to work pretty good. So that SJO ran from the back here under the camper along the propane line where it's zip tied all the way to the front compartment, where it then re-enters the bottom of that bay in another piece of conduit right angle, which I also sealed up. So when that piece of wire comes up through the front compartment up here, it then went into a second transfer switch, is the power outlet. On that transfer switch, I then wired directly my inverter to one side, only wiring one hot wire into, it was actually leg 2, which was a problem we'll talk about in a second. And then I wired another 7-foot pigtail that went from there just as a cord with an L530 end on it that would go straight into my generator. So that way, all I have to do if I want to run the generator is pull a short cord out of here, plug it in, turn it on, and it's good to go. Now the problem that we had with that is this front transfer switch did not like the inverter. It didn't like it at all. And so at first I wasn't getting any power through, and I figured out that was because I had leg 2 on and not leg 1, and that's where it sensed the power. So then I did that, and after the 30-second delay, you would hear it kick on. Well, then you'd have the 30-second delay in the back. And whenever it should have kicked on in the back, this front transfer switch just started going crazy, clicking, 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 clicking. So I couldn't figure out exactly what that was. Now I have a friend named Michael Bracewell who has a video on installing the Renogy inverter, very similar to mine, but he also used a gopower transfer switch, but he used the 30 amp version. And so he had mentioned in his video somebody with their email address that was very knowledgeable. So I sent them an email. They responded back to me within 10 hours. And they told me that, you know, the problem was probably more in the way that the transfer switch works. They actually said that the inverter, being that it's not a high power source, should only go through one transfer switch. So the way that they said that I should set it up, which was pretty complex. Actually, the transfer switch that was closest to the power distribution center would choose between the inverter, because it would only go through one, or the other power source. And then the second transfer switch that fed into that transfer switch would be between the shore power and the generator. And they also recommended rewiring the circuit for the converter to the transfer switch. And so it just all became a very big headache. This was going to require running multiple wires, multiple ways, because of just where I have to put the stuff because of the layout of the camper. And so because of that, I decided X-nay on that. We're going to go back to our original plan. So after that, I took the wire from the inverter, which is directly wired in, which I'll say the only thing that I'm not happy about so far with the Renogy inverter is that I wanted a 10 gauge wire right there, because that thing can power, it's a 2000 watt inverter, but it's got like a 4000 watt surge. So I wanted to wire it directly. If you just plug a plug into one of the plugs there, it's got a 15 amp limit. And so it doesn't have that if you wire it directly. But I wanted the wire to be good and heavy, so I used some 10 gauge wire that I had laying around. But the problem is the lugs on that inverter where you wire it in, they were really too small. I had a really hard time fitting that 10 gauge wire in there, but I eventually got it. So I took that wire and I just got a 4-inch metal box, and I got a L530 power inlet receptacle, just like the one that's in the generator. So that way it's the same plug. I don't have to get any adapters or anything. And while that's plugged in, I can just flip the inverter on and off as I want to. But if I want to turn on the generator, even though I got a remote start in there, I do have to come out, unplug that out of the power box and plug it into the generator. So it's kind of a pain, but it's a lot better than what we had to start with. And it's a lot better than all that mess that we were going to get into if we kept down the road we were on. All right, so that's our cord that goes to the front of the camper. This is where we have our connection, because I'd already had that cord smaller. Then we have our L530, fits the generator and fits the plug right here that's plugged in for the inverter. And that just runs over yonder. So should work a lot better. Now, because I had the transfer switch up here, which I did remove, I had to, I put a 4-inch metal box there. And I wish that I had a little bit more length on that main SJO cord that went out under the camper, but I already had it cut off because I already had it in the box that I wanted it in. So that limited where I could put it. But then I had that 10-3 wire, and then I had the 10-2 wire that went to the generator and the inverter for the pigtail, right? So I had another wire that I had to go in there. So I took the hot wire that was from the pigtail and I wired it and split that current between both of the hot wires that went to the front. So now this means that that whole system's going to be powered up. So when I turn the inverter on, the converter's still powered up. Now the way that I chose to do this, because I still wanted to power the converter when the generator's running, is I flip that remote on that we were at inside, and I go over to the distribution panel and I just flip the breakers off for the fireplace and the converter and everything on that side. And so it's really not that bad of an issue, and it makes it really easier than running the cable the way we used to and everything like that. And I'm really pleased with it so far. So all in all, our initial testing with the systems worked well so far. I'm really happy with it. I'm happy with all the components that I have. I do wish that that front selection was more automated between the inverter and the generator, but I think it'll turn out fine. I'm just pretty excited that we have the functionality that we have now, and that we don't have to rely on getting that big heavy cord out every time we just want to plug the generator in for 5 minutes. So I'll give this one a thumbs up, even though it wasn't quite as automated as I would like.
Do not forget to hit that subscribe button.